What's going on, guys? I'm CFB Kings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. It is officially August. College football returns this month, and that feels amazing to say. 3 weeks from Saturday, we'll be dialed in on week 0. Florida State and Georgia Tech will be getting us started out in Ireland, and I cannot wait. But before the season gets underway, I wanted to preview another team that I think could have a major impact on their conference title race and the 2024 college football playoff. The Texas Tech Red Raiders are a team that I think could play a major role this fall, not only because I just led them to a national title in my college football 25 dynasty, but because I genuinely believe that they have real potential to succeed this season. Last year, Texas Tech went 7-6, but they were very close to having a completely different season. They started the year losing by 2 on the road to Wyoming in a crazy double overtime game. They led 17-0 in that game and missed 3 field goals. They could have won by 9 in regulation if they had made their field goal attempts, but Wyoming also needed a 4th down touchdown in overtime to stay alive. It was a ridiculous play where their quarterback got leveled, but still managed to get the pass off, and then the Cowboys won on a 2-point conversion attempt right afterward. In week 2, they lost 38-30 to Oregon in a back-and-forth game that came down to the final minute. Last season, Oregon only had 2 opponents keep a game within 1 possession. Those teams were Washington, who beat them twice on their way to the college football playoff and national championship game, and the other was Texas Tech. And the Red Raiders arguably should have won that game. They led the Ducks by 9 in the fourth quarter and were -4 in the turnover margin. Turnovers were something that plagued them all year long, and I'll talk about that throughout the episode. But Oregon took the lead on a field goal with 1 minute and 10 seconds left in the game, and it was 31-30 before Texas Tech threw a pick 6 to go down by 8 with 35 seconds left. So it was really even closer than the score depicted. Texas Tech also missed a field goal in that game, which loomed large down the stretch when they trailed by 1 with 1 minute left. In their first Big 12 game of the season against West Virginia, the Red Raiders had some brutal injuries. They lost starting quarterback Tyler Shuck for the season after he fractured his fibula. They brought in backup quarterback Baron Morton, who also got hurt in that game when he suffered an AC joint separation, which is basically separating your shoulder blade from your collarbone, and that was in his throwing shoulder. And I've actually had that same injury, and it does not feel good. But despite that, Morton not only finished the game against the Mountaineers, but played the rest of the season with it. Morton only missed 1 of Texas Tech's last 10 games, and he was their leading passer in 8 of them. The Red Raiders ended up losing by 7 on the road to West Virginia after failing to tie it on a 4th down attempt from the 11-yard line. Against Kansas State, Texas Tech had more total yards than the Wildcats and lost by 17. Texas Tech had a number of these very statistically odd anomaly-type games, very similar to Clemson's season last year. If you haven't seen the Clemson preview that I made a couple weeks ago, make sure to go check that out after this. But Texas Tech outgained Kansas State by 45 total yards and had 17 less points. They were -3 in the turnover margin with an interception at their own 11-yard line. Kansas State scored on the next play. They had 2 other interceptions, both in Kansas State territory, and one was in the end zone that was downed for a touchback. They also turned it over on downs at the K-State 29-yard line. Against BYU, it was a similar story. The Red Raiders outgained the Cougars by 112 yards and had 7 more first downs, but lost that game by 13 because they were -5 in the turnover margin. This was the only game that Morton didn't play after that West Virginia game, and third-string quarterback Jake Strong threw 3 interceptions. They also fumbled a handoff exchange that was recovered in the end zone for a BYU touchdown. They fumbled on 4th and 1 at the BYU 3-yard line, which they recovered and ended up being a turnover on downs. So they really had 6 turnovers in that game and lost by 2 possessions with their third-string quarterback. Then their last loss of the season was by 50 to Texas. They were just all-around outmatched in that game as the Longhorns went on to win the Big 12 and go to the college football playoff, and they were a play away from making it to the national championship. And that game was just not Texas Tech's day. They had a crazy play where Morton threw a pick 6 because the pass bounced off their running back's foot straight up into the air and was caught and taken the other way for a touchdown. But that play was pretty indicative of that game and really Texas Tech's whole season. In their wins, they beat their FCS opponent, Tarleton State, 41-3. They beat Houston by 21. They beat Baylor by 25. They beat TCU by 7. They beat number 16 Kansas by 3 on the road. They beat UCF by 1 and capped off their season beating Cal by 20 in the Independence Bowl. So 7-6, but they outgained Wyoming by 111 yards. They led 17-0 in that game. They're actually +1 in the turnover margin, but missed 3 field goals, which are basically turnovers themselves, and lost by 2 in double overtime. They outgained BYU by 112 yards, but -5 in the turnover margin, lost by 2 possessions. They outgained Kansas State by 45 yards, but -3 in the turnover margin, lost by 17. -4 in the turnover margin and missed a field goal against Oregon, lost by 8. It was an injury-riddled and turnover-plagued season that was very close to being an 8 or 9 win year if things went their way a couple times, which they just never seemed to. Moving on to 2024, the Red Raiders will play Abilene Christian, Washington State on the road, North Texas, Arizona State, Cincinnati, Arizona on the road, Baylor, TCU on the road, Iowa State on the road, Colorado, Oklahoma State on the road, and then we'll wrap up the regular season at home against West Virginia. That is the 69th toughest strength of schedule according to the ESPN FPI heading into the 2024 season, which is the 9th easiest of any team in the Power 4. There are only 8 Power 4 teams with an easier projected schedule. Texas Tech gets their first bye week before taking on Baylor, and their second before traveling to Oklahoma State, which, as of right now, is projected to be their toughest game. So they get a little scheduling advantage there with that bye week timing. And then traveling to Arizona will also be a challenge, especially since that game is at the end of a 6-week stretch where they play every single week before that first bye. But they start with 4 home games in the first 5 weeks, with the only road trip being to Pullman against Washington State, who was unfortunately harmed greatly by all of the conference realignment garbage last year, and that led to the destruction of the Pac-12 and left the Cougars without a conference. Washington State had 27 players transfer out, including starting quarterback Cam Ward, who went to Miami, and their best wide receiver in Josh Kelly, who is now with Texas Tech, which I'll talk more about later. Also, like some of the other teams that I've previewed, their schedule is pretty backloaded, especially the last 4 weeks of the year. This is, I think, where they'll make or break their 2024 season when they play Iowa State, Colorado, Oklahoma State, and West Virginia. They lost to West Virginia by 7 last year in that injury-riddled game, like I mentioned before, but they didn't play Iowa State, Colorado, or Ollie Gordon and Oklahoma State, so it'll be interesting to see how they match up with those teams this fall. Moving on to Texas Tech's 2024 roster. So I said at the beginning that I used the Red Raiders for my dynasty in college football 25, and with them I was able to win the national championship in the first season. And while I was playing with them, that's when I realized that I wanted to preview their 2024 season on the show because their offense is going to be a lot better than most people really know. At quarterback, they lost Tyler Shuck, who transferred to Louisville, but they returned Baron Morton, who really became their primary starter last year and was their leading passer at the end of the season. He threw for 1,757 yards and accounted for 19 total touchdowns last season, and did all of that with an injured throwing shoulder and in only about 8 full games worth of playing time as the main guy. Morton has been rehabbing that shoulder and was limited for some of the spring to make sure that he'll be as healthy as possible heading into fall camp. Behind Morton, they brought in 4-star recruit Will Hammond. He was the number 13 quarterback in the class of 2024. Hammond was a finalist for the Mr. Texas Football Award for the best high school football players in Texas, which ended up going to Florida commit DJ Lagway, but Hammond was right up there with him. At running back, Texas Tech returns their top 2 rushers from last season in Taj Brooks and Cameron Valdez. Brooks rushed for 1,541 yards and 10 touchdowns, averaging 5.3 yards per carry, and Valdez rushed for 285 yards and a touchdown on 52 carries, averaging 5.5 yards per carry. Brooks had the 4th most rushing yards of any running back in the country last year, and the 2nd most rushing yards of any returning running back, behind just Oklahoma State's Ollie Gordon. Brooks is a part of the preseason Big 12 All-Conference team and was named to the Walter Camp preseason All-America team as well. Needless to say, he's expected to be one of the best running backs in all of college football this year. At wide receiver, they lost 3 of their top 4 guys in terms of receiving yards last year, but to be completely honest, I think the receiving core will be better this season than it was last season. They lost Xavier White to the NFL, Jaron Bradley transferred to Boston College, and Miles Price transferred to Indiana, but they had a very balanced receiving room, and it's not like they're losing guys who just did everything for them last season. Xavier White, for example, he was their leader in receiving yards, but he had just 1 receiving touchdown. Price was their leader in receiving touchdowns with 5. From that receiving room, they bring back Coy Aiken, Jordan Brown, Dre McCray, and tight end Mason Tharp. Aiken had 416 yards and 2 touchdowns. Brown had 256 yards and a touchdown. McCray had 255 yards and 2 touchdowns, and Tharp had 178 yards and 4 touchdowns. To that group, they're adding Washington State transfer Josh Kelly, who had 61 receptions for 923 yards and 8 touchdowns last year for the Cougars. He averaged 15.1 yards per catch. They brought in Florida transfer Caleb Douglas, who had 11 receptions for 133 yards and a touchdown last year before suffering a leg injury that sidelined him for the majority of the season. He's 6'3", 185, and a talented receiver, but just hasn't gotten to play much yet. The Red Raiders also added 5-star recruit Micah Hudson, who is the number 4 player in Texas, the number 4 wide receiver, and number 16 overall recruit in the class of 2024. He committed to Texas Tech over Texas A&M, Alabama, Georgia, and Ohio State. He is Texas Tech's highest rated commit ever, according to 24/7 system. He's one of the best high school wide receivers in the country, and he was also a finalist for that Mr. Texas Football Award with Will Hammond and DJ Lagway. Hudson was a critical part of my college football playoff run in CFB 25 with Texas Tech. He's insanely fast. EA gave him a 92 speed rating, and he has the second highest overall rating of any receiver on the team. And that's as a true freshman who hasn't played a snap of college football yet, which is pretty impressive. But a ton of fun to play with on the game, and he'll be a major addition to that Red Raider roster for this season. They also brought in 4-star Arizona State transfer tight end Jalen Conyers. Over the past 2 seasons for the Sun Devils, Conyers accounted for 876 total yards and 6 total touchdowns, averaging 11.6 yards per catch. They also added Oklahoma transfer tight end Jason Llewellyn, who is 6'5", 255, as well for some depth. On the offensive line, they returned Sheridan Wilson, Caleb Rogers, and Ty Buchanan, and then added Vinny Scurry from Toledo and Sterling Porcher from Middle Tennessee. Scurry started 33 consecutive games for the Rockets and is credited with 2,376 offensive snaps during his time in Toledo. According to Pro Football Focus, Scurry had the 12th best pass blocking grade in all of college football last year and allowed just 1 sack the entire season. So a veteran player going into his final season of eligibility to help solidify that offensive line, and he committed to the Red Raiders over Auburn during his transfer recruitment. Sterling Porcher started 25 consecutive games at Middle Tennessee, all 13 in 2022 and all 12 in 2023. In 2022, Porcher was named Middle Tennessee's Offensive Lineman of the Week after they defeated number 25 Miami by 14 on the road. He committed to Texas Tech after also receiving interest from Texas A&M, Baylor, Arizona State, and South Carolina. They also added Memphis transfer Davion Carter, who started all 12 games for the Tigers last season. According to PFF, he allowed just 1 sack on 522 pass blocking snaps and did not commit a single penalty in any game last season. In their recruiting class, they brought in 4-star offensive tackle Ellis Davis. He was the number 16 offensive tackle, number 31 player in Texas, and number 191 overall recruit in the 2024 class. They got him over Auburn and Stanford. They also landed JUCO offensive tackle Maurice Rodriguez, who is 6'7", 335, and the Red Raiders got him over Georgia, Florida, USC, and UCLA. On defense, they returned their top 2 tacklers from last season in linebacker Ben Roberts and safety CJ Baskerville. Roberts accounted for 107 total tackles, 6.5 tackles for loss, a sack, 1 interception, and 2 forced fumbles. Baskerville accounted for 78 total tackles, 4.5 tackles for loss, 2 interceptions, and 5 passes deflected. They also returned corner Braylon Lux and linebacker Jacob Rodriguez. Lux accounted for 40 tackles, 1 interception, and 9 passes deflected, and Rodriguez accounted for 32 total tackles, 1 tackle for loss, 1 interception, 2 forced fumbles, and a fumble recovery last season. They also added TCU transfer safety Javion Wilcox. He redshirted last year with the Horned Frogs, but as a recruit, he was a 4-star in the 2023 class. Texas Tech also brings in 4-star edge recruit Cheto Feely. He was the number 19 edge, number 34 player in Texas, and number 207 overall recruit in the class of 2024, as well as 4-star safety Peyton Morgan. He was the number 18 safety, number 35 player in Texas, and number 218 overall recruit in the 2024 class. And Texas Tech landed him over TCU, Nebraska, Arizona, and SMU. The Red Raiders were picked 9th in the 2024 Big 12 Media Preseason Poll, behind Utah, Kansas State, Oklahoma State, Kansas, Arizona, Iowa State, West Virginia, and UCF. They're a team that is very off the radar for most college football fans right now, but I think they may find their way quickly onto it in 2024. In the college football playoff era, since 2014, Texas Tech's most wins in a season is 8. Their second most wins in a season is 7. Those two win totals coincide with Joey McGuire's first 2 seasons as the head coach of the Red Raiders. They went 8-5 in 2022 and 7-6 last year, and that was a 7-6 that was largely due to injuries and turnovers caused by players being thrust into positions that they weren't really expected to be in last year. So it's really not a stretch to say that Texas Tech's best 2 seasons of the past decade have both come in McGuire's first 2 seasons there. What he's on the verge of building in Lubbock is very real, and I think that'll start to show this fall. I mean, like what I said with Micah Hudson, too. McGuire's been there for 2 seasons and already landed the highest rated recruit that Texas Tech has ever had. They also just made some major stadium renovations, and the energy overall around that program just feels very high right now. And I think 2024 will be a significant season for the overall trajectory of Texas Tech football. Going back to the schedule, one other thing that I wanted to mention was also who Texas Tech does not play this year. There's no Texas, there's no Oklahoma. Their non-conference Power 4 opponent kind of is Washington State instead of college football playoff contender Oregon, like last year. Then in conference, they don't play Utah, they don't play Kansas State, and they don't play Kansas. That's 3 of the top 4 teams favored to win the Big 12 this year. They did beat Kansas last year, but the Jayhawks have Jalen Daniels healthy at quarterback now, so who knows how that would go down this fall. For their Group of 5 game this year, they play North Texas at home instead of going on the road to Wyoming at night. Wyoming finished with 9 wins last year, and they were also tied with Texas in the 4th quarter when they played them, so they were a very underrated team last season, and that was quite the shock right off the bat when the Red Raiders went to Laramie, I believe is where they are, and lost to Wyoming. But they get their FCS opponent in week 1. Perfect way to ease into the season, get those early jitters out, get some backup, some experience right off the bat. They get their second bye week right before playing their toughest opponent on the road at Oklahoma State, whereas their only bye week last year was in week 9, and that was before they played 4-4 TCU at home. So their bye week really didn't give them any sort of scheduling advantage last year, but certainly provides them with an opportunity to rest up before their biggest game of the season, really, in 2024. There are a ton of things about this schedule, this roster, and this Texas Tech team as a whole that lead me to believe 2024 could be their best season since back in the Mike Leach days when they were winning 9 games a year. This fall, I think there's a world where Texas Tech starts 5-0 and is unbeaten heading into October before that road trip to Arizona. And while Arizona seems like one of their biggest obstacles this year, who knows, maybe with head coach Jed Fish leaving for Washington and a massive roster turnover in the portal, maybe things aren't quite gelled yet and they aren't that hot 10-win team that we saw down the stretch last year. Or maybe they are, and Texas Tech is just straight up able to beat them. The Red Raiders beat Baylor by 25 last year on the road. I could see them winning that game again. They beat TCU last year. I could see that happening again as well. And then down the stretch with Colorado, does Deion Sanders get things turned around for the Buffaloes, or are they still a 4-8 caliber team? There's definitely potential for a win there for Texas Tech. Oklahoma State on the road will be challenging. Texas Tech has lost the last 3 to the Cowboys, but they do get that bye week right before. West Virginia will be challenging as well, but they get them in Lubbock. Should be a solid game. I see the potential for the Red Raiders to go 9-3 or potentially better at 10-2 this year if they can reduce their turnovers and avoid major injuries like the ones they suffered last season. They certainly have the offensive weapons to light up the scoreboard and the firepower to keep them competitive in every game on the schedule, and I think they will be. Then on defense, they gave up 26 points per game last year, but that was largely due to the constant turnovers by the offense and favorable field position that their opponents kept getting, so the improvements that they made on the offensive side of the ball will also lead to more success defensively. I think they'll be a player in the Big 12 title race, and without playing Utah or Kansas State or Kansas, I wouldn't be all that surprised if Texas Tech ended up in the Big 12 title game themselves. I think that conference will be one of the most unpredictable, most balanced, and most exciting to watch this year, so it'll be fun to see how it all plays out. And one last thing before I end it here, I wanted to make a prediction. I think 2024 will be the season that we finally see Texas Tech ranked again. At some point throughout the season, I think the Red Raiders will find their way into the AP or CFP Top 25 for the first time since 2018 when Cliff Kingsbury was there. And maybe they'll even crack the top 20 for the first time since 2013. If you're watching on YouTube, I make this graphic every offseason and update any new highest rankings from the previous season. And every time I'm absolutely shocked that the highest the Red Raiders have been since 2014 is number 24, and that was in 2017. They've barely even gotten into a poll in the playoff era. But I think this year will be different, and next summer they'll see themselves in a better position on that graphic. Well, that's going to wrap it up. That's about all I had. Really appreciate you tuning in today. We are so close to college football, and I cannot wait for the season to start. If you liked what you heard today, make sure to go follow CFB Kings on Twitter and Instagram for all things college football as we embark on another season and dive into this new era, really, of our sport with all the recent changes. So, yeah, Twitter and Instagram at CFB Kings. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed and subscribe to the channel on YouTube or follow on Spotify if you're listening there. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day and take care.